Thank you. Sorry for the delay. So, yes, in giving this talk and being invited to give this talk, I had a think about well, how shall I pitch this, and what would be the best thing to use this valuable bit of time for everybody. And as you can see, I've got quite a varied background in this area, but it was quite fascinating to see the analysis you've done on some of the data as to areas I sort of have worked in. That's very interesting. I think this talk will reflect some of what you've just shown there. But I wanted to focus more on the vulnerability side of the disaster management area, and specifically the integrated disaster risk management area. And the reason for that was it seems that we are seeing a resurgence of hazard-orientated research in the field, and that's fantastic. And of course, it's a new take on hazards management. But all the time, we must remember that human vulnerability is really at the core of what we are dealing with in disaster-related issues. So I thought that in terms of perhaps just trying to redress or rebalance a little bit, I'll take us back into some sort of core features of the human vulnerability side of the equation. And more than that, I'm hoping to here just sort of create some ideas through reflecting back on some of my own work on what it really means to empower human vulnerability reduction using people-centered approaches. Okay, and I would like to do that with reference to the central importance of health and well-being. But this is really for everybody, because health and well-being is everybody's business. It's certainly not some separate area for health professionals, crucial though they are. So two things then: focusing on human vulnerability, using health and well-being to unpack that a little bit further. And all the time we're really talking about an integrated type of disaster risk management in doing this. Just one proviso, that there's such a huge topic, I can't cover everything, of course, so I've just pulled out some of the key areas I'd like to look at as covered on this slide here. So first of all, we should frame vulnerability in disaster risk management, and on the face of it, well, we have a hazard, and vulnerability is equal to risk. We can start there, but there's a lot more to it, of course. The rationale then to compounded vulnerability reduction through a people-centered decision-making in disaster risk management requires quite a lot of thought about what we mean by disaster vulnerability. Compounded vulnerability, well, we have compounded risk, we have cascading risks, we have all sorts of current terminology, but all the time, of course, we have a compounded vulnerability as well, where one vulnerability form of exposure, for example, to a hazard is then compounded by perhaps a socioeconomic susceptibility to being affected in the first place. And the knock-on effects of that mean we have a compounded vulnerability. Therefore, addressing this requires essentially a people-centered decision-making process to be able to deal with the complexity. Thirdly, in engaging vulnerability reduction relative to reactions to different types of risks, local knowledges are crucial. There needs to be different ways of engaging people, and the only way of doing that is to work with people's own self-efficacy, the things that people do in any case to reduce their vulnerability. And another key area about engaging vulnerability is the communication of risk and how we understand it, the adaptation processes that take place, be these instinctive type of adaptation process or ones that we encourage, and then recognizing capacities and working with the capacities. So this leads me to an integrated role of health and well-being, because when we invest in health and well-being in its broader sense, that's physical health, mental health, and health as a sense of social well-being, when we invest in that, then we offset disaster vulnerability. Exposure can be reduced, but your susceptibility to being affected by change can also be built upon. And this has in more recent years become the sort of focus of the language of resilience, but I don't really want to go into the various different definitions of what we mean by resilience. I prefer just say building up strengths to offset disaster impact. Then I've got some examples of this, and I deliberately go right back to earlier work. I'm still active, and some key current types of research topics, but I think a lot of what we're looking at currently has not really changed. So it makes sense to go back, and I'd like to bring some of these examples forward again. And then this is more for discussion. How do we therefore remove the barriers? And so I'll say a little bit about this when we get to that latter part of the talk, but I want to see if we can open up this discussion in the session if there's time, but if not, going forward into other moments that we get to interact with each other. So how can we move forward in addressing critical current and future emergencies using local and global people-centered actions on vulnerability and risk that, aided by open science, become more impactful on underlying processes of regional and global change? So the quest for impact through these approaches is what that is about. How can we do it? How can we remove the barriers to it? But what should we invest in? Okay, so that's a long introduction. So I'll be speeding up from here onwards as we get into the detail. So my own background in this goes back a fair while. It doesn't go all the way back through my life. I had a pre-research type of existence as well. And I worked in practice. I was doing surveying and measuring physical space in various different ways, and it led me into Southern Africa as a volunteer quite early on, having also worked in private practice in the UK, in the southeast of England, specifically in urban environments and also in rural spaces. So I was used to sort of measuring things, and when I started trying to understand things better, the why rather than just the what and the shape of things, getting into the why questions, of course, this takes you immediately into social space, and in trying to understand major catastrophes like recurrent disease epidemics in flood zones and in war zones, the importance of understanding both the ecological and social indicators, environment, society, and economy that underlie the types of situations I became exposed to through doing that sort of work. And of course, that leads to an understanding of the contextual changes which are causing the changes in the environment and the changes in society, what is making people more vulnerable. So specifically, I did my early research on the socioeconomic and demographic factors that influence human vulnerability and exposure to infectious disease catastrophes, basically. And this sort of then evolved into looking at uneven development of risk and risk intervention. So some of the earlier references are there, and in this, my first book was about environment, health, and population displacement. And yeah, that was almost like trying to work out, first of all, the ecological indicators, then the social indicators, and then what produces those indicators, and getting more involved in the contextual factors. Okay, so that's just a bit about where I'm coming from. And of course, immediately the story can get quite complicated. But in terms of a more direct and summative approach to what we're talking about here, you could say, well, we've got vulnerability as conditions that reduce people's ability to prepare for, withstand, or respond to hazards. And then, counteracting that, there's the capacity side of the equation, which is the positive conditions or abilities that increase people's ability to deal with hazards. This, of course, in a disaster risk management context in this case, That's not so different in other disciplinary areas as well. But particularly today, we're focused on disaster risk management. So in doing the management, then what do we engage? Well, we should presumably therefore engage vulnerability reduction, but we can also achieve a lot by understanding capacities and working with capacities. And this is something I've been driven by for a long time. It's trying to work out what works, right down to some current work on what data works in bringing about change, what capacities are there. And you know, before long, you start to realize, well, the capacities are usually latent, they are there, but there are barriers, obstacles to that. So we end up with a more sort of a structural analysis of vulnerability. Vulnerability is human-induced. It's produced by systems of power and inequality. So basically, in addressing capacity, which is latent, we need to remove the barriers to being able to do that. So this is an action-orientated approach. Now, that's not new, and many people would instinctively recognize that and have dedicated much of their effort and work into trying to address that particular side of this, and certainly long before some of the examples I'm giving you here. But so it has a big background in participatory work, and the participatory paradigm, particularly in development studies, has been very useful as a sort of overarching type of domain within which some of these sorts of ideas have developed. But when we put this into risk framings and the world of risk management, disaster risk management, then we end up with a lot of things to consider. And these representations illustrate the varied emphases that influence reactions to disaster risk. And this is important because it influences the way that people react to comprehend and then engage with the vulnerability side of disaster risk reduction. So you can go down the formulations here, and every so often I add one in or alter one. You know, I'm no smarter than anyone else on this who works in this area, and you know, we have to go back and revise and rethink and work out what's really driving you know, our interpretations of disaster risk. And rather than make it sort of an inward thing, what's driving my interpretation, it's all about listening to different cultures and different contexts within which people are dealing with disaster risk. And these are certainly some of the versions which seem to stand as relevant, whether real or perceived, but in the way that people react to disaster risk. And of course, we can see vulnerability and capacity in most of these, particularly on the bottom line, where we have the ones in green. This is either about capacity, and of course, capacity relies on vulnerability reduction. Okay, so these interpretations are open for us to look at. We can come back to discuss those later if you so wish, but I think I need to keep a reasonable pace up here. If we go through each one of those, we will be here for a very long time indeed. So my point really then is to then think about how we move towards engaging vulnerability reduction, and noting that participation and empowerment issues are ongoing and important to that process. So I've gone back, as warned, to some of the basics, which are really our understanding of what citizen participation is in the first place. And if we translate that into what I would call people-centered disaster risk reduction, which is a fairly well-established area now in global discourse, then the people-centered disaster risk reduction presumably is all about what's going on at the top of Einstein's ladder of citizen participation, where we deal with citizen control, delegated power, and partnerships. And this is as critical today as it was when Einstein was making his point about it back in 1969. And the analysis of what we mean by participation is there in summary on the right-hand side: collective action aimed at achieving a common objective. So just taking part or being involved is one form of participation, but there's a sort of passive participation where you're involved but not necessarily very active. And there's also the active participation where people are able to take initiatives independently from external institutions. And then, we end up with what is often has to be a more idealized area, but hopefully in practice, sometimes we see this happening and we get real results when people are actually at this point where whole groups of people become empowered. And then you get progressive progress or participation that enable actions for change in people's own interest, but also in the common interest. So this is a sort of critical area of where we want to really be, I think, in terms of now what's now really high-level emergency situations globally, and the need for really fully engaged disaster risk reduction that has impacts and that is doing what it says on the tin, actually reducing disaster risk rather than just letting it all happen. So there's different ingredients to this, and there's a propensity for collective action and trusting partnerships as an important part of this. Around the top of the ladder there, it was partnerships was mentioned, and trusting partnerships are one way of doing that. So cooperation is always going to be better than competition in this sort of area, surely. But it's about understanding and working together. So meet locally experienced needs is essential to doing that, because there's so much difference around the different at-risk locations that we need to understand, of course, the localization of risk. Empowering the poorest to deal with uneven development, enhancing local management capacity, and increasing confidence in local and indigenous knowledge are part of this solutions of developing vulnerability reduction and disaster risk management from within. Okay, so reasons that the people-centered, let's say, participatory approaches in disaster risk management are effective. Well, this is almost like a slide I could put on at the end as well. It's a sort of interim conclusion, if you like, but we will be going on from here a bit further. So value judgments are made more grounded in everyday life of those exposed to disaster threats. So and others are able to hear about these value judgments, but they're more grounded in everyday realities if we have people's involvement in their own assessments. Those at risk feeling vulnerable or exposed may take on ownership of risk assessment and management themselves. Not necessarily, but that opportunity is there, and it's often taken. And we see remarkable things that happen at the very localized level, where individual households perhaps start to assist a neighbor's household in getting out of the flood zone fast enough, or in bringing in supplies when there is a disease epidemic going on. And this can be some of the most powerful forms of emergency management. Distributed risk governance is less dependent on external financial incentives that may be manipulative and misinformed. Later, I've got a slide which just reminds us about the global situation of aid flows and the dependencies that these create. The global systems of power are always there. But for the moment, let's say, well, if we have the efficacy of the participatory type of approaches in our work, then we are inviting a more distributed type of risk governance at the local level that moves away from some of those forces. We can't escape them completely, but we can resist and change and modify their influence. So local engagement brings significant returns in implementing strategies of preparedness, since it gives rise to people managing their own space, also allowing for adaptation, innovation, and creativity. Now, I'm speaking to a group here who are all one way or the other involved in disasters-related research, and understanding that research, listening to research, doing it themselves when possible, and so forth. And you can think of many examples, I'm sure, in the last 15, 20 years, where you have seen examples of fantastic work going on, where people have discovered that, in fact, there are local solutions to local problems, and these can be really quite effective, and they're often creative. I've seen some fantastic presentations recently. Actually, just yesterday, there were several in the IDRiM Young Scientists session presentations, which talk of innovation, adaptation, and creativity in the work, the varied different types of work that people are involved with. And usually this is going on at the local level. There's more maneuverability at that level. Societies are diverse groups amongst which it is often problematical for one type of person to designate another as vulnerable. So when we work at this disaggregated level, then difference is easier to cope with. Generalizations can be avoided, and protection of those significantly at higher risk. And by that I mean not just relative or perceived risk, but the actual real impacts of day-to-day events, the extreme poor, who are the most exposed, then there is the opportunity for collective support on people's own terms within their own sort of cultural and economic predicament. Right. There's ways of trying to formalize that, and we have to be careful here. And I've been over quite a few projects sucked into this sort of approach, and for good and for bad in some respects. For good, in that local level organization can be really powerful and work, but also here we have to be careful that we don't recreate institutions and structures, imagining that somehow this will provide the magic bullet type of solution. But through experience, there's been a lot of good come out of things like a risk and resilience committee at the local level. Resilience forums can play a part, but they don't always work, and they have different forms of governance, and this is something we need to really understand. But it is a way of getting investment from the state sector, even the private sector, into new forms of institutions. And institutions, of course, are always going to be there. So better we have perhaps well-grounded institutions than ones which are completely top-down and remote from what we're looking at. Now, I said I would also say a bit more about this sort of health and well-being approach, and it's relevant broadly because it is about investing in a way where we build a type of people-centered or inclusive and also environmentally aware and economically just type of approach. So this is an old framework really to emphasize why we can, how naturally health and well-being are there in any case in what we do. So if we're looking at ecosystems, then we know about the emergent disease ecologies from different types of habitats and how habitat loss can stimulate new hazards coming from those types of contexts. And down in the middle box here, through the sort of vulnerability side of the equation, we get increased exposure to unhealthy environments and increased susceptibility to ill health in those contexts. And over here, you've got the more sort of political economic side of the equation, where investment in health is one way of strengthening our disaster preparedness and also our disaster response system. So it becomes quite dependent on financial investments and infrastructural viability. In summary, I think many of you would have seen some of these slides before. I use them frequently just because it helps orientate myself into where I've come through from with this sort of basic idea about offsetting. So it's like this: you move from vulnerability to well-being, and then you identify the different ways in which you can do that. Okay, I don't think we need spend too long on that. The point is that you build up to offset. Similarly with this diagram, this demonstrates, though in this case, that the health and well-being security offset equation can work in advance of major disaster impacts at point B here, and it continues to work afterwards in the recovery. This looks a little bit like one of those bounce back type of diagrams now, doesn't it? But anyhow, it's about building essentially health security and well-being up, and there are different health security thresholds, and if we don't watch out, we dip below those thresholds by increasing vulnerability. As we increase vulnerability, we can become closer to a critical health threshold, and of course we know what happens then. We can have an epidemic and even a pandemic. So the latest COVID-19 pandemic that we've all lived through has raised some interesting questions about exactly how these thresholds are produced by humanity themselves. And of course there is still the random evolution of pathogens, disease-causing agents to deal with, and that is very much the domain of biological hazards. And so, although I'm focusing on vulnerability today, this is not to diminish in any way the importance of understanding hazards in depth. So the health and well-being approach is also reflected here in this early warning and early action diagram, which I also frequently refer to from World Disasters Report. And there's other versions of this this early warning and early action has come round again, as it's a sort of it's very strong discourse in global agendas going forward. It's not going to go away anytime soon. So good to keep this alive. This is the IFRC published this, and it was basically just trying to say that we invest in improving well-being, and then you motivate people, and the knowledge and the capacity and the resilience flows from that. Because it's early warning systems, then the indicators are needed in any early warning system. We need to measure things, monitor change, but these indicators become more actionable in this type of understanding of where they're coming from. So we get comprehensive indicators, social vulnerability indicators combined with climatic indicators, combined with infrastructural indicators, economic indicators, and then we can get early warning and action of changing environmental threats. And actually, for that matter, there's no reason why this can't be translated to early warning for other catastrophic events like conflict. And the learning process in it here is, needs to get sort of quite opened up. And the key point here would be the change environment at the bottom here, where we're addressing power, technology developments, and behavioral change. So these three components tend to be very strong roots into change environments. Okay, but the indicators in the system are going to have to include a level of intuition, because we're dealing with events which haven't yet happened. Of course, it's evidence-based. This is about research, but to ignore some of our intuition and rely entirely on experiential learning could cut us a little bit short, particularly when we haven't really thought through some of the things that might happen next. Okay, so a next second summing up slide now then, and it looks like I'm okay. I've been asked to speak, by the way, for about 45 minutes to 1 hour, warning, but I see we might be a bit less than that because that's a very long time. But this is a summing up slide at this point. So there's a vulnerability provisor for disaster avoidance in highly exposed settings, and it includes many things, but these are some of the things I'm sort of flagging right now. Investment in quality of life that includes primary subsistence. So we need to invest in, and these are just the things we need to do. Okay, and no need for me to read all of that out, but investment in quality of life that includes primary subsistence being water, nutrition, energy, shelter, sanitation, those sorts of things. If we invest there, this is merely saying put development into disaster risk reduction. But secondly here, recognizing risk engagement enhancers. So it's easy to say the first one, but the second one, how do we really enhance engagement in the right type of decision making in a world where we're surrounded by the wrong type of decision making? So what are the risk engagement enhancers? How can we get people to engage with situations of uncertainty? We learned the lesson with climate change, didn't we? It took 20 years just to get to a reasonable level of unanimity in policymaking environments that it's actually happening at all. So, what are the ways of engaging people in the process of recognizing risks earlier and going by the evidence-based approaches, listening to the science? And this is where making science more open becomes really important. So the capacity enhancement has to go with that. Increasing knowledge without action is going to be limited. And that means communication, information sharing, recognizing what type of data works in that process as well, building capacity. And we have made huge progress in capacity enhancement. How many training programs are there now in the world compared to 20, 30 years ago that look at disaster risk? And you can study the subject in detail in higher education these days, only in a more limited way previously. Professionalization in the industry itself is pretty important, and there's also a lot of work going on to try and do this across the humanitarian sector as well. Okay, so and then linking these things together. So risk engagement and resilience building through is not just about prevention, it's about what we put into the recovery process. So putting prevention into recovery, which was the theme of one of our Dealing with Disasters conferences a few years ago. And now perhaps in the last sort of major push on this presentation about trying to empower vulnerability reduction in disaster risk reduction, then I've got some stories really, which I hopefully will sort of be of interest. So my screen is partly blocked out by icons and things, which is why I'm hesitating occasionally. I can't quite see what I've written in the top there, but oh yes, right, okay, got it here now. Right, so let's listen to some of these stories. So listening to people is really important. It takes a long time to realize that though you've got lots of training and exposure to international forums, leadership roles, and supposedly reasonably well published in the subject area and so forth, that at the end of the day, what you really need to do is sit down and listen to people. And particularly people who are living the day-to-day life of avoiding major hazards and trying to deal with produced vulnerability. i.e. where they've been excluded, marginalized. And this was the case with this group of women living on a shifting bit of sand in the Jamuna River in Bangladesh. These are char lands. These are the poorest areas, and you don't own the land. You go there because you don't own anything, and it's a place you can eke out an existence. But this group were extremely successful at doing that, and there was a project assisting with that. Not all development projects are a waste of time. Some of them are really very useful. This was an example of a project which was just a catalyst for people sorting out their own problems and, well, dealing with the insurmountable threats of the Jamuna River itself, but also being marginalized. Listening to these women, they said, we're grateful to the project for helping us to be able to live in this place. They built resilience. They could now avoid the worst of the flooding events more effectively due to the networking in the area, the provision of some supplies. They built a sort of eco type of village here so they could not be dependent on food aid and so forth. But people's aspirations are always for more. They want a health post in a school now. That was the nature of the conversation, getting beyond just being resilient, not just surviving, but thriving. This is really important to everybody, everywhere. Okay, and of course, there's always data behind these things. And also we listen to a lot of people there about that. And I suppose the story here is that at the core, there's livelihoods, food and money, the things that people care about most in their day-to-day lives, but that affects your sense of wellness. And then you have a sort of more secured health sense in the broadest way. And this is, definitely moving away from living in a vulnerable type of status. Okay, so lots of projects that looked at this type of thing in respect to health. So I slipped that in here, but maybe I'll just move on to the specific examples. Okay, so what came out of that was the point of putting this here. So a lot of different types of projects, and there are others, and they're not all health related. But these were this was a slide from tracing the health related strand within it. But the point is that quite straightforward, accessible findings come out of these, and but these are the important part, really, which all that research and listening to people and trying to communicate it, write it down, and do something useful with it. At the end of the day, where does it lead? Well, some of the findings really need to be kept alive. So we've got this one here. Even in marginalized situations, people can control ecological and other risks, health risks, where these are well understood. So understanding risk, fortunately, has now been for some time the priority one in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, understanding risk. And then it's possible to reduce the impact of hazards, risks, and disasters on health and well-being in society, or we could just say on disasters, without knowing all of the elements and linkages in the system. So we need to be really professional at living and working with uncertainty. Local level self-care in context of appropriate risk stewardship and governance, and enhanced learning and research with appropriate science and technology predisposes to disaster resilience. So if we are going to use disaster resilience as our focus, then what predisposes to an all-encompassing type of disaster resilience? Well, there's certainly the local level self-help and self-care and empowerment, as the word I'm using a bit more today, is really critical to that. So these are fairly straightforward messages that I hope you would immediately recognize from this type of work. I've got some more recent things. I've done a lot of referring back to earlier work, but it's also interesting to revisit. And this is a good example of that. And I'll credit Idris Alam in Bangladesh, and Professor Idris Alam, who's from Chittagong University in Bangladesh, for his lead in these publications, which I've had the privilege to also work with over a period of time. Because it goes, we've got this first one about looking at cyclone disaster vulnerability and response experiences in coastal Bangladesh from 2010, and then revisited it in this year. And so we just published this one, Change in Cyclone Disaster Vulnerability and Response in Coastal Bangladesh. There is quantitative data throughout these two publications. But what comes out of it is the findings indicate significant improvement in all sorts of circumstances around the cyclone belt in Bangladesh. Significant improvements. I think it might be reasonably well known that deaths in cyclones have gone down significantly in Bangladesh from tens of thousands. In the 1970s, even higher than that, with a cyclone or flood-related element, but of course also conflict and famine and so forth. But the point is that the numbers directly related to cyclone have gone right down, very, very low. And it's important that we analyze why that is, why we get an improvement, not just why things get worse, but why they get better. So the significant improvements include things like the house structures and design, income levels have changed. There's diversification in types of income that people do. Not everybody is just planting rice and catching fish from the river. Those things carry on, but in a more diverse type of way. So there's other income generating activities going on. There is education, and I would add also an increase in education, in women and girls education, awareness, individual capacity, and poverty reduction factors are evident, but there is still lots of poverty. But the lowering of dependency in the area is having an effect. And then there's the availability of mobile phones, radio, TV, social media platforms, enhanced social connectivity, and greater gender equality and empowerment help to facilitate disaster preparedness, evacuation, and response. Now, that's by listening to hundreds and hundreds of people who were around older people. There could be some methodological flaws when we talk about people's memory when you get old. But if I go by my own experience, my long-term memory is not too bad. The problem is I can't remember where I put my glasses, 5 minutes ago. But the point is that there's an apparent, undeniable improvement in the situation because mortality is down. Okay, so understanding how empowered vulnerability reduction really has an impact is something that's going to be quite effective if we can keep that going, but it's not straightforward. And I've got that one very positive story there and in terms of reduced mortality, but meanwhile cyclones are increasing. They're increasing not only in the Bay of Bengal, they're increasing in Mozambique. If an area is affected by some other cascading type of or compounded vulnerability, then we're not going to see these improvements too rapidly. The jury's out in the case of Mozambique. I've just come back from there 2 weeks ago, and the jury is out, i.e. the decisions are not, we can't conclude what the recovery process is really like there, I don't think, yet. But there's been Cyclone Idai in 2019, and then various cyclones since, and Cyclone Freddy in March. And these are increasing. Climate change is real, it's happening, and it's being experienced in countries like Mozambique in particular. So we'll have to see what happens there. But, I've opened up a dialogue with local partners there around this, and there's a big interest in it. Others will be doing similar sorts of things in trying to understand what works in terms of the recovery process, and also building resilience into recovery. But you see, it's a shame, because if we had everything working from the bottom up in this type of way, then we would expect to see that progress, the potential progress and the forces of capacity, empowerment, translating into greater human rights, and we would see it moving in the right direction as the obstacles would be removed. It's not some sort of utopian sort of panacea, but we would see many examples of improving situations. The problem is we live in a very insecure global context, and there are explicit ways in which vulnerability is being increased. I was just taking this one example. You can think of many examples for yourself, but we talked about health and health risk reduction and building resilience. Meanwhile, we've got to remember that we've got the rapid onset type of destruction of infrastructure and deliberate moves to target the very sort of foundations of resilience in society. And this is seems to be an increased phenomena. And here we have the example of the destruction of health services in various parts of the world. I won't go around naming where this is happening, but you all know where the big conflicts are happening in the world today, and you probably have your own opinions about what the causes of those are. The point is that we're seeing an increase in targets on humanitarian assistance, on healthcare infrastructure. This is quite remarkable. So that's an example of rapid onset type of impacts on what we're trying to achieve from the bottom upwards. And then there's, of course, underlying, creeping, sort of slow development orientated influences on that as well. Overseas development assistance is dropping in a lot of places, but it has historically been going up. But as a percentage of the wealth that's out there, it's got smaller. There's lots of problems with development assistance. In any case, it can create dependencies. It can actually run counterintuitive to a people-centered disaster risk reduction approach, which is dependent on local knowledge and local ways of doing things, local ecologies. But nonetheless, we have to have humanitarian assistance for ethical and clearly obvious reasons of gross inequality, injustices. And so these global structural forces are still here. This is about food security, and this is from the UNICEF model of food security. I've just sort of expanded a little bit to identify some of the different processes and levels at work here. And you could say, well, the nutritional status part is right down at the lower level there. And we can work backwards up as well and increase nutritional quality at a local level and have an impact going back up this. But the stronger forces currently are the structural drivers, the political and economic forces, and the changes we're seeing in climate are partly linked to that as well, bearing down on the food security situation. Now, I think I'm nearly out of time from what I can see on the clock there, so I'm just going to bring this to a more speedy set of final points. So reversing vulnerability through the humanitarian imperative, just a little bit more on this global level. It's basically, it's open to contrasting scenarios. So one is you create dependency, and we do more sort of delivering aid and pushing it from the top down. But this diagram illustrates some of the problems with that, and it doesn't really. Again, it runs counterintuitive to a people-centered bottom-up disaster risk reduction, which is empowered. So that's what's illustrated in the diagram there. But we've got some very good awareness within significant parts of policy environment. It's just it's not empowered sufficiently. I thought the World Humanitarian Summit of 2016, the first of its type, held in Istanbul, came up with some pretty good goals. So these principles are there. So we have core responsibilities identified I mean, these are great things, but how do we translate that into reality? So these examples that I show, and now we're going to go into any great detail, but I suppose this is just providing some evidence that there are lots of examples, and please do think of your own examples. These are projects I've been involved with where we've listened to people a lot, but also tried to develop the different ways in which you can do the research, also engage the system in the research as best possible to try and create longevity and impact. Okay, so these are sort of from those sorts of projects. This is back in Mozambique now, but from an earlier project. Better understanding of how to invest in risk reduction and management is part of the learning process. And I don't claim to have all the answers, but I am aware of some of the very necessary processes which are required. And then ultimately risk reduction strategies get adopted for local implementation. And there's some features of these, and this sort of reiterates some of the earlier interim findings I presented. Low cost and linked to suitable monitoring systems. They can be adaptable to local knowledge and perception, and felt as effective within the community that adopted it, creating a stimulus for risk reduction coordination. There is one more example here, but I think, I don't really want to say all those words in detail, but I'm conscious that people will be referring back to this presentation, which is going online, and they may like to look also at this example from the establishment of risk and resilience committees in Nepal, in this instance, using this local level type of approach. And the activities in that, it shows some of the things you can do to try and implement that approach. But all the time, we need to be questioning what's effective and what's work. This is not a checklist, say, do these things and you will get empowered vulnerability reduction. It's not saying that at all. These are examples of some of the research processes we have to go through to be able to then understand as best possible some of the pathways to empowered vulnerability reduction. And there's inevitably data involved in all of this. I haven't shown a lot of data today. I've been talking about the lessons learned from gathering data. These are just some examples from that process. I'll end on this. Sorry, I was a little bit fast on the last one. Just to reiterate, this is from a case study in Nepal for people who might want to read about some of the practicalities of trying to run local level engagement projects. If many of you will have experience of this yourself, and others don't work in this particular area, and perhaps this could be useful to get some examples of things you can do in the practical way to learn about what's going on. This is the second to last slide, and it builds on this local level learning example. This one has been sort of actually developed from various examples. I don't think it was just the Nepalese one, but across the board, there's different types of projects that I've been involved with and others have been involved with, which tend to look for these sorts of answers to how to make it more people-centered from a vulnerability reduction point of view, but also often in terms to improve hazard management as well. Though today I've focused on vulnerability, hopefully. Okay, so it says at the bottom here, no one size fits all. These are final examples here, are just really by way of example. So I'll end now and leave you with this discussion point, though please do ask any types of questions you want about the presentations, things I've said, things that need clarifying, things you disagree with, that's fine. But if we're a bit short of that, then there is this discussion point for now or ongoing. How can we move forward in addressing critical current and future emergencies using local and global people-centered actions on vulnerability and risk that, aided by open science, become more impactful on underlying processes of regional and global change. Thank you.